The Wedding Day Secret. I can't do this, Linda. If the Beatles end, I end too. Paul McCartney collapsed to his knees in his wedding suit, tears streaming down his face. It was March 12th, 1969, 2 hours before he was supposed to marry the love of his life. And the man who'd charmed millions was having a complete breakdown. Linda Eastman stood frozen, her wedding dress half-zipped, watching her fiancé fall apart. In her hand was a small 8mm camera she'd been using to document their wedding day. She didn't stop recording. She couldn't. What happened next would remain the most intimate, devastating footage of Paul McCartney ever captured. Footage that the McCartney family has kept hidden for over 50 years. Because what Paul revealed in those 2 hours before their wedding would explain everything about why the Beatles really fell apart, and why, even on the happiest day of his life, Paul McCartney couldn't escape the feeling that his world was ending. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most private moments, you need to hear this. Because the man who seemed to have everything was secretly terrified he was about to lose it all. 2 hours earlier, Cavendish Avenue, St. John's Wood, London, March the 12th, 1969, 10:30 a.m. Paul McCartney stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. Downstairs, wedding guests were arriving. The press was gathering outside. In 2 hours, he would marry Linda Eastman at Marylebone Register Office, and the world would celebrate another chapter in the fairy tale life of a Beatle. But Paul's hands were shaking. Linda appeared in the doorway, radiant in her wedding dress, her camera in hand as always. She'd been documenting everything, their courtship, their engagement, this perfect English morning. She loved capturing real moments, authentic emotions. "You look terrified," she said gently, still filming. Paul forced a smile. "Just nervous. Big day and all that." "Paul." Linda lowered the camera slightly. "Talk to me. What's really wrong?" That's when Paul's carefully constructed composure cracked. "I had another fight with John last night," he whispered. "About the wedding. About you. About everything." Linda's heart sank. She'd hoped that today, at least, would be free from Beatles drama. "What did he say?" Paul walked to the window, looking down at the photographers gathering on his street. "He said I was choosing you over the band. That getting married was just another way of me trying to control everything. That I was—" Paul's voice broke. "That I was destroying the Beatles." John's words had cut deeper than any criticism ever could. Because secretly, Paul feared John was right. For months, Paul had watched his best friends grow distant. John with Yoko, George with Indian music, Ringo with acting. Paul was desperately trying to hold it all together, becoming the unofficial leader nobody wanted him to be. The wedding was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance for happiness that didn't depend on 3 other people's moods. But as Paul stood there, in his morning suit, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers, he realized something terrifying. He didn't know who he was without the Beatles. The boy who'd met John at a church fete in 1957 had disappeared somewhere along the way. When had Paul McCartney stopped being a person and started being just a quarter of something larger? When had his individual dreams become so tangled with collective success that he couldn't tell where he ended and they began? "Paul," Linda said softly, still recording, "come sit with me." Paul sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. Linda kept the camera rolling, instinctively knowing this moment needed to be preserved. "Tell me what John actually said, word for word." Paul looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. "He said, 'You used to care about the music, Paul. Now all you care about is playing house with your American bird.'" Paul's voice cracked on the word bird. Then he said, "Maybe it's time you chose, her or us." The camera captured Linda's sharp intake of breath. She'd known John resented her presence, but she hadn't realized the depth of his hostility. "And what did you say?" "I said—" Paul wiped his eyes. "I said I shouldn't have to choose. That loving you doesn't mean I love them less." But John just laughed. He said, "Everything's changed since she came around. You've changed." Linda set the camera down on the nightstand, but left it running. She took Paul's hands in hers. "Have you changed?" Paul was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he whispered, "but not in the way he thinks. I've changed because I've found something I want to protect. I've found you. I've found the idea of a life beyond the madness. And that terrifies me because I don't know if I'm allowed to want that." The breakdown Linda's camera captured what happened next. Paul, overwhelmed by months of pressure, completely fell apart. "I can't marry you," he sobbed. "Not if it means destroying everything we've built. I can't choose between the life I had and the life I want." Paul paced their bedroom like a caged animal, his wedding suit wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. "Do you know what it's like? Being responsible for everyone's happiness? John's angry if I try to lead. George is angry if I don't. And now they think you're taking me away from them." Linda watched through the camera viewfinder as the man she loved unraveled completely. But she also saw something else. A person who'd been carrying an impossible burden for years, finally admitting he couldn't carry it alone anymore. "What if we don't get married today?" Paul said suddenly, his voice breaking. "What if we wait? What if I fix things with the band first? What if I prove to them that you're not the enemy?" Paul stopped pacing and looked directly at Linda, his eyes wild with desperation. "I've been Paul McCartney the Beatle for so long. I don't know how to be Paul McCartney the husband. What if I'm terrible at it? What if I disappoint you the way I've disappointed them?" Linda watched through the camera viewfinder as the man she loved unraveled completely. But she also saw something else. A person who'd been carrying an impossible burden for years, finally admitting he couldn't carry it alone anymore. "What if we don't get married today?" Paul said suddenly. "What if we wait? What if I fix things with the band first?" That's when Linda made a decision that would change both their lives. She turned off the camera, stood up, and slapped Paul across the face. Paul stared at her, shocked into silence, his cheek reddening. "Paul James McCartney," Linda said firmly, her American directness cutting through his English politeness. "I am not marrying a Beatle today. I am marrying a man who has every right to be happy, to be loved, to build a life that belongs to him and not to the world." Paul touched his cheek where she'd slapped him, tears still in his eyes. "Now," Linda continued, her voice softening but remaining strong, "you can spend the rest of your life trying to make everyone else happy, or you can start making yourself happy. But you cannot do both. And I will not marry someone who thinks loving me is a betrayal of his friends." Linda walked to the window, looking down at the photographers gathering in the street. "Those people down there? They don't love you, Paul. They love the idea of you. Your friends? If they can't be happy for your happiness, then maybe they're not the friends you think they are." Paul stared at her for a long moment, this remarkable woman who'd just told him truths he'd been too afraid to admit. Then, unexpectedly, he started to laugh. "You slapped me," he said, incredulous, wiping tears from his eyes. "I'll do it again, if you keep talking nonsense about not deserving love." Paul's laughter grew stronger, and Linda found herself laughing too. The tension that had been building for months suddenly broke like a fever. "I love you," Paul said simply, "more than I've ever loved anything. More than the band, more than the music, more than the fame. I love you, and I want to marry you. And if that makes me selfish, then I'll be selfish." Linda turned the camera back on, capturing Paul's transformation, from despair to determination. "But what about John? What about the Beatles?" Paul was quiet for a moment, thinking, "John once told me that all you need is love. Today, I'm choosing to believe him." The Wedding Marylebone Register Office. March the 12th, 1969, 1:47 p.m. Paul and Linda arrived at their wedding 17 minutes late. The press assumed it was typical rock star behavior, fashionably late, making an entrance. They had no idea that the groom had just chosen love over loyalty for the first time in his life. The ceremony itself was small, intimate. John, George, and Ringo weren't there. They'd made their feelings about the marriage clear enough. But Paul's stepmother was there, beaming with pride. Linda's Daughter Heather stood beside them, curious about this new man who was about to become her stepfather. Mike McCartney served as best man, offering quiet support to his brother. The photographer captured Paul and Linda, looking radiant, completely in love. What the photographer didn't capture was the quiet conversation Paul and Linda had just before the ceremony began, away from the cameras and witnesses. "Any regrets?" Linda whispered, adjusting Paul's tie one final time. "None," Paul said firmly, and for the first time in months, he meant it completely. For the first time in years, none at all. But that wasn't entirely true. As Paul spoke his vows, promising to love and honor Linda for the rest of his life, part of him was thinking about three friends who weren't there to witness the happiest moment of his life. Part of him was wondering if choosing love really meant losing everything else he'd ever cared about. When the registrar pronounced them husband and wife, Paul kissed Linda with a passion that surprised even him. It was a kiss that said goodbye to his old life and hello to whatever came next. In that moment, he wasn't Paul McCartney of the Beatles. He was just Paul, a man in love, starting fresh. The answer to his doubts would come soon enough. 3 days later. The morning after their honeymoon, Paul woke up to find a letter slipped under his door. It was from John, written in his distinctive scrawl. "Paul, congratulations on your wedding. Hope you'll be very happy. George and I have been talking. We think it's time for a break. Maybe a long break. Maybe permanent, nothing personal. Just time to explore other things. Love, John P.S. You were right. All you need is love. But sometimes love means letting go." Paul read the letter 3 times before showing it to Linda. When he finished, Linda was crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But Paul wasn't crying. He felt something unexpected. Relief. "Don't be sorry," he said, pulling her close. "You saved me, Linda, from a life where I would have kept giving pieces of myself away until there was nothing left." Paul walked to their bedroom window, looking out at the London morning. "Besides," he said quietly, "endings aren't always tragedies. Sometimes they're just new beginnings." Linda picked up her camera and filmed Paul in the morning light, peaceful for the first time in months. She didn't know it then, but she was capturing the exact moment Paul McCartney stopped being just a Beatle and started becoming himself. The hidden footage for over 50 years, Linda's wedding day footage, remained in the McCartney family archives. The intimate 8mm film showed a side of Paul that the world never saw: vulnerable, terrified, human. It showed the exact moment he chose personal happiness over public expectation. After Linda's death in 1998, Paul considered releasing the footage as part of a documentary about their marriage. But ultimately, he decided some moments were too private for public consumption. The footage still exists, stored carefully in the McCartney estate. Paul's children have seen it. They understand now why their father fought so hard to protect his family from the spotlight, why he valued privacy above all else. Because they've seen what happens when love has to fight for survival against the demands of fame. They've seen their father make the hardest choice of his life and make it correctly. "She saved me," Paul told his daughter Mary years later, referring to that wedding day breakdown. "Not from the Beatles, from losing myself completely." The wedding day that almost didn't happen became the foundation for everything Paul built afterward: Wings, his solo career, his family, his life on his own terms. And it all started with a woman who loved him enough to slap sense into him, and a camera that captured the moment a Beatle remembered how to be human. Sometimes the most important victories happen in private. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose happiness, even when everyone else thinks you're making a mistake. Paul McCartney learned that lesson on his wedding day, and Linda Eastman made sure it was all captured on film. Epilogue: over 50 years, Linda's wedding day footage remained in the McCartney family archives. The intimate 8mm film showed a side of Paul that the world never saw: vulnerable, terrified, human. It captured the exact moment he chose personal happiness over public expectation. Paul's children have seen the footage. They understand now why their father fought so hard to protect his family from the spotlight, why he valued privacy above all else. They've seen their father make the hardest choice of his life, and make it correctly. She saved me, Paul told his daughter Mary, years later, referring to that wedding day breakdown. Not from the Beatles, from losing myself completely. Years later, Paul was asked if he ever regretted choosing love over the band. The Beatles were the best thing that happened to me, he said. But Linda taught me I deserved to be happy. The footage remains locked away. Some stories are too sacred for sharing. But for those who wonder how Paul survived the Beatles' end, the answer is simple. He chose love, even when it was terrifying, even when it meant starting over completely.